right, over to Keith Grant with the results of a new survey giving us insight into how Kansans feel about these presidential candidates and other key issues. Keith?
Christy, a recent survey found that most people will vote for Donald Trump in Kansas. Now, this is part of the Kansas Speaks statewide public opinion survey. That survey talked with 645 adults between September 26th and October 16th, so it's pretty recent. Among respondents who were registered voters planning to vote, 48.2% would vote for Donald Trump and 43.2% would vote for Kamala Harris. Now, that was if the election were held when they took that survey. Dr. Alexandra Middlewood, a Wichita State professor who helped with the survey at Fort Hays, explains why she found that 5 percentage point difference interesting.
Do I think that the margin is likely to be that slim? No, probably not. But considering that Donald Trump won by over 14 points in 2020, even that little shift in the margins could affect some of these down ballot races.
Okay, here's a look at some other findings from that survey. 72% support expanding Medicaid in Kansas, while 73% support medical marijuana. 61% support legalizing recreational marijuana, and 55% of those surveyed are against the Kansas government placing restrictions on abortions. Another interesting note, Christy, the Washington Post decided to not endorse a presidential candidate this election, and it's having a ripple effect. 3 of the 9 people serving on the paper's editorial board have resigned, and according to NPR, more than 200,000 readers canceled their digital subscriptions to the Post. Sources say the Post editorial board had written an endorsement for Vice President Kamala Harris, but owner Jeff Bezos refused to let the paper publish the endorsement. Bezos responded to the controversy in an op-ed published Monday in the Post, arguing an endorsement would create the perception of bias, but regretted that the non-endorsement decision was not publicized earlier.